Hey rockers! Alright, today we're going to do the 18th century and we're going to spend a bit of time in the beginning covering La Guérinière because he got her, but we've got other videos on him. We're going to go a dive into Austria and a dive into Prussia with all sorts of good stuff and good stories about people doing all kinds of mad craziness with their horses as well as horse training. So if you like it, give us a thumbs up. Please hit the subscribe button, tell a friend. Welcome back, fellow horse history classical nerds. I'm a big nerd for this stuff. You might notice in this video on the 18th century that after this little preamble, you're going to see me shaved. That's because this little preamble we did in the last video, we ended up recording with no sound. So apologies for the weird continuity. But what we're going to talk about in this one is the bits of the 18th century you may not be aware of. Most people in classical dressage know about François Robichon de la Guérinière, who wrote his famous École de la Cavalerie in the 1730s. Now, we are going to talk a bit more about him, but we did his own video. If you look around, maybe it's coming up now. If not, just search in our playlist on our channel. You're going to find our La Guérinière video. So I will be talking a little bit about him, but I also want to talk about people you may not know, like Adam von Weyrother, who was a contemporary of La Guériniere's in Austria, and who was going back and forth between France and Vienna and was running the Spanish riding school there, and was described as the perfect equerry. We definitely need to know because he's taking the classical principles into the Germanic style. Then we're going to talk about a bad boy, Friedrich Wilhelm von Seydlitz. He's lots of fun. He's a cavalry commander for Frederick the Great. And he is the guy who says, yeah, all this dressage stuff, absolutely, we need it. We need our horses to turn on a dinner plate and all that stuff. And at the same time, we've got to be good cross-country riders. Our horses have to be able to handle anything that comes to them. And so he really sets the tone for, if you like, the modern sport riding, but in a very, very practical military context. He's got all kinds of cool bad boy stories, some of which I will tell, as well as some of his training. And then we're going to wrap it up by looking forward through what's going to come next with the French Revolution and how that changes everything and sets us up for the 19th century. So let's kick off by looking at Monsieur François Robichon de la Guérinière and the clarity that he gives us. So this clarity that we get from Mr. La Guérinière is really useful. What he says is that the horses also of the previous generations, which were pretty much what we'd consider like Lusitanos today, were beginning to disappear a bit from the northern courts, France and so on, and be replaced with slightly bigger, slightly heavier types of horse. And because of this, you could no longer, he says, train the horse simply in the circle anymore. And what he means by that is the kind of shoulder in the circle, not just a circle, which was the method of Pluvinel and Cavendish and so on. And that you had to now add something for the outside hind leg, not just the inside hind leg, because of course the shoulder in the circle just looks after the inside hind leg. With a super balanced Iberian type of horse, that can sometimes be enough to really collect them, but not with other types of horse. So he says we've got to have this shoulder in thing. He talks a lot about the shoulder in. People think that he invented it. He didn't. He doesn't say he did, but he does emphasize it. But then he says you need this other thing too. The shoulder in will take care of the inside hind leg, but then you need something for the outside hind leg. So he talks about croupe au mur, the croupe to the wall, which today we call Renvers. And he says if you add these two things together and you keep kind of switching between the two of them softly, you end up in piaffe. And if you can end up in piaffe, then you can go to other cool things like pirouettes, terre-à-terre, which is piaffe in canter, and so on. And he kind of proves it. And those of you who've watched a couple of our videos of the in-hand work with my horse Hidalgo, you'll see that, yes, it's really borne out. We do it right there on camera for you. And La Guérinière turns out indeed to be right. So this is great. He also gives us all kinds of diagrams to follow, which give an interesting insight into how dressage has changed since then. For example, you won't find stuff about flying changes in here. You'll find stuff about counter change of hand, which is how to use the counter canter in all sorts of really interesting ways. Because I guess, given that people were still coming out of the cavalry tradition, you couldn't necessarily worry about whether you were on the right lead or the wrong lead. You had to have a horse that was super balanced. Also, in the manège, meaning in the riding school, not the ménage, as we English often mistranslate manège, in the manège, people were doing these exercises in a very balletic, very slow way, as opposed to on the battlefield where they were having to do them in a really fast way, because people didn't want to fall off and hurt themselves. So things, not unnecessarily anyway, so everything gets sort of slowed down, made very balletic. And then you'll also see in here the use of a square as well as a circle type of volta. And he says some horses really respond very well to this. And I know trainers, even to this day, who use those squares and actually train flying changes off them. So it's a very interesting thing to play around with Mr. La Guériniere's very, very practical handbook, because it kind of translates over into a lot of the modern stuff that we do. Pirouettes are in here, airs above the ground are in here too. Good. We are on team La Guérinière. Now, there were some other people, though, in the 18th century it's really worth talking about. One of them was an Austrian dude called Adam de Weyrother. So that's Weyrother. Difficult name for the Brits, for the English people, but Weyrother. He was going to hang out with La Guérinière in Paris quite often from Vienna. The French and the Austrians were always allies in the various wars of the time against people like Prussia, against Russia, against us Brits, etc. So he took a lot of Adam de Weyrother happened to be the one of the directors of the Spanish Riding School of Vienna. So he took La Guériniere's stuff and brought it back and said, oh, we could kind of update a little bit what we're doing there, which was still very much based on the Pluvinel older model. And they began to put on more rad shows. Great. This is still court riding. This is still manège riding. So again, everything is slow, everything is balletic. Of course, there has to be a little bit of rivalry in there too. So Adam de Weyrother writes that he actually thinks that the Austrians actually ride a little better than the French. He particularly marks out a bloke called the Count von Paar as like the top dude. You can always expect these kinds of rivalries. Who knows if it was even true or not? But Adam de Weyrother talks about the thinking rider. So he's doing all the same stuff that you'll find in La Guérinière, but he really emphasizes the intellectual flexibility of the rider, that if something comes up that is unexpected, or your horse is having difficulty with something, or it's just not going as planned, you need to make a new plan. You have to ask yourself, where is my horse today? You have to ask, do I need to change the exercise in some way or other? So it's very rational. There's no kind of make the horse do it stuff, which comes as some surprise, really, when you're going back 300 years. You know, you're talking about times of public execution and, you know, public floggings and things like that. People weren't always so nice to their animals, let alone to each other. So it's very interesting that you get this kind of Enlightenment thinking. And this kind of runs all the way through all these videos that we're doing. You'll generally find that all the big masters who are writing these books always talk about the need to master your emotions, and that this is really one of the best things that horse training can offer us, because it makes you a better human being if you really go for it, because you just can't be losing your temper all the time, and you can't be throwing tantrums all the time. And this is really important if you're an aristocrat, because you're brought up spoiled, you're brought up always getting your way, and you know, that leads to some poor choices in life, like duels, and losing your family estate at the gaming tables, and doing reckless things on the battlefield and so on. So the idea is, you know, to rise above all that and use the horse training as a way. And his book translates in English to The Perfect Equerry, An equerry is the person who looks after the royal stables or looks after the stables for, you know, an institution, a household. Even the Queen today, or now the King in England, has an equerry, a royal equerry. So he says, you know, this is how you become a dude like La Guérinière. You've got to run the royal stables, you've got to keep it all running for these mad idiots called the kings and the queens who you've got to produce these amazing horses for. All right, now, we're in the German-speaking world here, and we're going to move across to Germany. But just before we do, this Adam von Weyrother dude is going to give birth to a legacy, which we're going to look at in the next video, which results in a bloke called Maximilian von Weyrother, who becomes like the top dude that all the people in the Spanish riding school today would kind of bow down and worship and say, that was the dude, that dead dude over there. We've got to give burnt offerings at his altar. And we'll talk about why, because Maximilian, who comes along later, again updates the whole thing. And that's when we're going to get flying changes and cool stuff like that coming in. Okay, but right now we're going to stay in the 18th century. Let's move across to Prussia. Now, a lot of you will have heard of the Warmblood. Some of you may own Warmbloods. Who were the first people to really start to play around with this? Well, it was Frederick the Great. Frederick the Great really put the institutional stamp on it. Of course, there were other people doing it at the time, but Frederick the Great of Prussia basically invented or helped develop the Trakehner. And the Trakehner was a little bit of an answer to the English, who were at the same time producing the thoroughbred, which of course is very light, very fast, but a little bit nuts sometimes and could sometimes tune the rider out. And people would breed for that because they would want the horses to go really fast. There was a lot of interplay between England and Prussia and the House of Hanover. You've heard about Hanoverians, etc. At the time, you've maybe heard about the Georgian era in the English monarchy. That's the 18th century when the empire really gets big. You get 4 Georges in a row. Guess what? They're all Germans. They're not English. The first one didn't even speak English. The English kept getting these dudes who were Protestant, but cousins of the line, and to come just and sit on the throne in England. And they say, just shut up and sit there and you can have lots of money and lots of fun, but don't meddle in politics. Let us run it. Just sit there and be Protestant. And so the Georges said, yes, aye, sir, because, you know, it's a good life and we'll all become multi-billionaires if we do this. So under their watch, you had this interplay between Prussia, Hanover, and the UK, which to some degree still goes on today. So, of course, they were looking very closely, the Germans there, at what the Brits were up to with their horses. And they said, you know, this is quite cool. We'd like to have these fast horses that can kind of jump. That's also quite useful. But we need a horse that can think a bit more as well. And that also can carry a bit more weight for a cavalryman. So they come up with the Trakehner, which is the kind of first proto-Warmblood. And there is a cavalry general who really takes this horse and takes it to its apogee. And his name was Friedrich Wilhelm von Seydlitz. So Seydlitz. He is a great character. He's worth reading up on because he's just, his life, someone should make a movie. He's one of these larger than life characters who, you know, is a bit of a bad boy, but does a lot of cool stuff. He revolutionizes the cavalry in Prussia to the point that they can go around beating everybody. And Prussia's a little country, right? But they go to war with Austria, which is the whole, you know, Austro-Hungarian Empire. They go to war with Russia. They go to war with with France. Sorry, and these are bigger powers. And what they figure out is that if they can have cavalry that's more manoeuvrable and better at hand-to-hand fighting than all the other people, they can basically smash up anyone's army on the field. Because remember, this is before muskets get really good. They're still having to slowly load them like this. It's before cannons, you know, go through their next round of development. So horses on the battlefield are still really important. And if you can get in amongst a group of infantrymen, you can basically chop them to pieces. And if you can get in amongst the artillerymen, you can kind of do the same thing. So this is like the golden age of cavalry. And there's a bunch of wars that happen there. The War of the Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War, the Silesian Wars, blah, blah. And these go on all over Europe. And Frederick the Great kind of comes out on top. And he kind of comes out on top. By the way, he's also fighting for gay rights while he's doing it. He's a well-known homosexual, and he kind of brings that a little bit to the fore. So that's an interesting cultural side note. But von Seydlitz is the dude in his army who creates this maneuverability in the cavalry, which means that they're bringing a lot of good dressage in, but they're also bringing in cross-country riding. There's a real importance of jumping. In fact, von Seydlitz apparently never left his estate except by jumping the gate. And he makes all of his cavalry do the same thing. Frederick the Great also says we need our cavalry to be ultra, ultra aggressive. So even in their personal lives. So for example, there was a rule if you were part of a cavalry regiment and there was any kind of perceived insult to your honor, you had to fight right there immediately. Challenge, pull out your sword and go for it. The need to be able to maneuver your horse in tight circles without any tension from the horse, basically to turn on a dinner plate is how von Seydlitz talked about it, is of course going back to the old passades of the 17th century and the 16th century, but they add a little bit more science to it because they're looking towards La Guérinière, they're looking towards von Weyrother. So they're also learning how to do it really slowly and accurately in pirouettes, and then they can do them as really fast passades on the battlefield if they want to. Because they're so able to move in 3 dimensions through all of this, and they're using the shoulder in and they're using the Renvers, they can get in amongst infantrymen, where traditionally the man on the ground has the advantage to the man on the horse because he can move around better, and the guy on the horse can actually chop him up. This is how good they were. All right. Now, von Seydlitz was a bit of a mad bastard, really. He was a wild dude, and his father died young, and he was brought up by the Margrave of Brandenburg. Brandenburg is where Berlin is, who was known as the Mad Margrave. And the Mad Margrave was also a cavalryman who emphasized wild daredevilry. Apparently he once challenged von Seydlitz as a teenager to ride a wild stag, which von Seydlitz apparently did and survived, didn't fall onto the horns, onto the antlers and impale himself, so that's good. But daredevilry became part of the training. So one of the things that von Seydlitz was famous for, and apparently he got some of his people to do, was to ride at speed through the moving sails of a windmill. You can imagine what would happen to you if those sails caught you. That would be it. Basically, you and the horse, poof, off. And you had to do this kind of thing. Okay, so your riding had to not just be daredevilish, but accurate. Okay, back to the thinking rider. There's another great story about von Seydlitz where, as a junior officer, he was asked they were asking, what's the caliber of the artillery that's being fired at us? We need to know so we can understand, whether we need to be in or out of range. And apparently he rode his horse straight into range, let the guys fire at him, saw one of the cannonballs hit the ground, dismounted, got it, wrapped it in a handkerchief, and then brought it back to the general to say, okay, this is the caliber. So this is the kind of bravery you're dealing with. Now, being cool under fire meant that the horse had to be cool under fire as well, of course. So there was a big emphasis on bomb-proofing and on desensitization, which goes back even to Xenophon, the Greek guy who says, you've got to start taking your horse to the marketplace when he's a very young horse and let him get used to all the sights and sounds and start, smashing pots and having fires, and things like that, and falling leaves even going on around you. Von Seydlitz really takes this to another level, so that the idea is neither the cavalryman nor the horse will ever have a negative reaction to something bad going on and will not lose their heads so that they can remember where to put their feet. The jumping becomes so important that it begins to affect the English. So it's a moot point about who really got the jumping going in equitation. Was it the Brits with their fox hunting, or did the Brits borrow what people like von Seydlitz were up to and add it to their fox hunting? Or did von Seydlitz borrow what the British were up to and add it to his battlefield? We don't know, but what we do know is there was an interplay between these guys going on in the same way that there was an interplay between Austria and France going on in the dressage, and they were all mixing the dressage together. All right, so whether you've got someone doing it in the fast cavalry style like von Seydlitz, check him out, he's interesting. Whether you've got someone doing it in the balletic style like Adam von Weyrother or La Guérinière, helping us still to this day to train our horses, we have a great legacy from these guys. And I've got a treat for you. The dude who is the publisher of this line of books, who's called Richard Williams, who's a great dude, who lives in Virginia in the USA and has had to translate or help translate and edit and re-edit all these texts, knows them really well. And so we're going to start doing a series with him, doing deeper dives into these masters, because he is actually using them to train his horses in an even more detailed way even than I am, and he's going to give us all his tips. So stand by for that. But for now, that's the overview, roughly, of the 18th century. If you liked it and you found it was good, comments below, please. And give us a thumbs up. Give us a subscribe. Hit that button. Tell your friends that there's good nerdy stuff over here on the Dressage Nerd Rockers channel. And we will see you on the next one for the 19th century.